Jackson, Mississippi has had an unreliable water system for a decade, and they have lost 25% of their population, along with the jobs that go with it, because of that water crisis that went on for way too long. And so water is the foundation of the economy in so many ways. And because it's hidden underground, oftentimes people just take it for granted that the water coming out of their tap is going to continue to flow at the quality that they've become accustomed to. And that's not the case. The federal, state, and local governments have a responsibility to invest in the infrastructure that is going to protect public health, which is critical. It's going to keep water bills affordable, which is also a public health issue, and that's going to fuel the economy. It should be a higher priority for this administration, for the Congress, and I hope it does become one.
Welcome to the Make Water Work podcast, where we dive into the people, ideas, and innovations shaping the future of water. I'm your host, Isaac Pellerin, and alongside my co-host, Megan Glover, the founder of 120 Water, we bring you insights from hundreds of incredible conversations we've had over the past 9 years with inspiring and energizing leaders in the water industry. Each week, we share those stories and conversations with entrepreneurs, community champions, and innovators who are making water work for everyone. Whether you're a water professional, a curious innovator, or simply passionate about our most precious resource, this podcast is for you. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Make Water Work podcast, where Isaac and I chat with industry professionals across the nation who are making change, innovating, and just all-around rock stars. Today's guest is no stranger to being a rock star in water. Her name is Deirdre Finn of Finn Strategies, but formerly executive director of CIFA, which CIFA is the Council of Infrastructure Financing Authorities and responsible for the SRF programs, which is a highly under-talked about kind of niche program, but makes massive impact in being able to fund our nation's most critical infrastructure projects that protect our public health. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation with Deirdre.
It is. And it's really hard to find someone who is more passionate about what the SRF can do, its impact, and how to advocate for what our communities need. And so I am very excited that you all get to listen in on this conversation that we have with Deirdre Finn.
I am very excited to welcome Deirdre Finn, who I met, within the first year of starting 120 Water. I was introduced to this organization, which we'll talk about, called CIFA, and it's where all of the SRF fund managers kind of hang out. It's their association. Mm-hmm. And I was a fish out of water, and I just remember how much the association and even Deirdre herself was just so instrumental in helping understand a little bit more about this world that we're about to talk about. And so, Deirdre, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Megan and Isaac. It's nice to be here.
Yes.
Talk about my favorite subject, water and the SRFs.
Talk about being nerds. Here we go. So one of the things that we like to ask everybody who comes on the podcast, because everyone we've met over the last 9 years has a story. So how did water find you?
So it found me in a change of my career. I had been working in politics for several years, and then I had my daughter and wanted to settle down into a more normal job. And I got a job at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection without actually knowing the first thing about water. And so my assignment was to write about water. And so you can learn a lot when you have to write about a subject matter. And so I became more and more involved in communications and worked my way up to chief of staff in a policy role. And then ultimately went to the governor's office as deputy chief of staff. For water, I ended up doing a lot of emergency management because we had 4 hurricanes in 44 days back in 2004. It was a year of fours that year. But I loved it. I worked on restoration of America's Everglades, protection of freshwater springs. There was a tort reform bill called the Litigation Reform Act. So it was incredibly important work, and I felt it was very meaningful. And so I never really went back.
Yeah, I love that. Water did find you and it hooked you. So then from kind of hooking you at the state level, then to working on the national level through various associations, and most recently as executive director at CIFA. How was that shift going from state to now national policy? And is that something that,
Well, it's a huge difference. And before CIFA, I actually worked for the Water Reuse Association and Research Foundation, which was a really another niche area. Water, people kind of have a broad brush of water, but there are a lot of niche areas, water reuse being one, the SRFs being another. And so it is state advocacy and federal advocacy have the same core elements, but the dynamics are incredibly different. I mean, on in state advocacy, and I've advocated in states across the country. It's just very different. There's a real interest in getting in depth. You work directly with lawmakers, whereas on the federal level, there are a lot of issues. And so the interest is spread a little bit thinner than it is on the state level. And so it takes a lot more energy, persistence, perseverance in order to advance any type of policy on the federal level. And I would say that that's across the board, not just for water, but it is a process.
Yeah. For sure. And I know in our conversation, we're going to talk a lot about SRFs. So before we dive into SRFs, could you just give us a quick kind of overview of what SRF is, kind of the SRF 101?
Sure. I would be happy to. So it's the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. And these are state-run subsidized loan programs that provide financing and financial assistance to communities to build infrastructure for safe drinking water, recycled water, wastewater services, stormwater management, environmental protection. It really is a very broad and expansive program. And I'll give you a couple stats because I always love to tell people how this is probably historically one of the best programs that the country has ever established, because the SRFs, because they are state run, they're able to finance a lot more projects than you can at the federal level. So in the course of the last 30 years, they've financed over 72,000 projects. And in 1 year alone, last year, the reporting year, they financed 3,500 projects. So imagine a federal program. It cannot even come close to the state programs. And the other thing that I will say about it that I really love is that we love loans. The SRFs love loans because they're reliable and sustainable, and they provide a permanent recurring source of revenue. And so $90 billion in federal funding has been used to generate 244 billion. That's right. 90 billion turned into 244 billion in financial assistance. And then there's 100 billion in funding that's going to remain in perpetuity to fund new projects for future generations. I mean, it is a reliable, sustainable, effective, and efficient program for any infrastructure, but in this case, water infrastructure.
Yeah, that sounds like an incredible ROI for something as important as water that drives our communities.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about what the future is for the SRFs, but it has been a really successful state-federal partnership. And I want to emphasize that aspect too, because the states get to customize the programs under a broad federal framework, which is what makes them so effective. And they can prioritize the money based on the needs in the state. So you don't have Virginia competing with Florida, competing with California for limited resources. Each state has their own funding to make their own decisions, and they get to revolve that funding so they can use it in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece about that. And maybe, Deirdre, for those of us or on the pod that may not know about it, can you talk a little bit about how those needs are solicited and then how those needs then manifest into the allocations? I think that's important.
So there's an allotment on the national level. So the Congress appropriates the money, and then they release it to OMB, the Office of Management Budget, and then they release it to EPA, and then EPA allocates it to the states. Now, on the clean water side, the allocation is established in statute, so which hasn't changed in 30 years. And there's a lot of difference of opinion on whether that should change, because population has changed, demands have changed in the last 3 decades. On the drinking water side, the allotment to the states is based on a needs survey that's conducted about every 4 years. So the results of the needs survey are what determine the allotment for the states. Within a state will determine what their priorities are, whether it's, prioritizing small communities or prioritizing regionalization or consolidation or prioritizing, compliance with water quality standards. And those are, made by each state, and they evaluate the applications as they come in based on those priorities. And almost all of them use a scoring, I think all of them use a scoring system. And so they score, and sometimes they get bonus points for being a green project, or they get bonus points if they're a disadvantaged community. And so that's how the funding is sort of allotted or allocated on each state level.
Yeah. Okay. And then, one of the things, I'm going to go off book a little bit, one of the things we've talked about, then how do utilities kind of access these funds and the process for that? And Deirdre, can you just kind of maybe share some examples of good about that process in terms of then how do the utilities actually use these funds to bridge the gap within their own operations?
Absolutely. So I think what's really important to emphasize is that every state develops their own interest rates, their own eligibility for grants or principal forgiveness. I just want to say principal forgiveness is treated just like a grant, but has less paperwork. So do not be afraid of principal forgiveness. It's not like debt forgiveness. It's principal forgiveness.
Okay. Yep.
Pro
and
tip.
They also create their own application process. They create their own, award process. Everything about the SRF is really customized. So you have, in every state, and often you have 2 different programs, one for clean water, one for drinking water, and then in 50 states in Puerto Rico. So every process is different. So to utilities, I always tell them, just apply. First question you should ask is there a deadline for an application? Is there a rolling application cycle? Are there multiple deadlines throughout the year? And then based on that, what is required? You have Kansas, which has a 1-page application in order to get on what's called the intended use plan. But in other states, I think Pennsylvania, you have to have, a fully baked, application. In Iowa, for example, on their construction grants, they have planning grants and construction grants, they have to have a full facility plan in order to apply. So it really varies. And so you really have to get on the website, read the intended use plan, which lays out exactly how the SRF plans to use the money, the prioritization, the process, and then apply. And I think, people always want to guarantee before they apply, or they want to guarantee that they'll get principal forgiveness or a grant. It's impossible, because it's different than a grant award. I just want to emphasize that there's a financial creditworthiness test to make sure you can repay the loan. On the drinking water side, there's a technical, managerial, financial aspect of it. And so it is a process, but once you're in the program, going back to it, and in some cases, in some states, Utah, Minnesota, Hawaii, Alaska, they have what's called programmatic financing. And so you apply once, and then every year you get a certain portion of money. You close on a different loan every year. But once you're in, you get you're basically financing your capital improvement plan, not just a single project. So again, I think there's great opportunity, but you have to apply.
Yeah. And I think Deirdre and Isaac, you hit on this button a lot in terms of, we talk about that the application process can sometimes be a barrier for small systems.
I know, like when we talk a lot to systems, if we're at a rural water association, or even we had our other guest, Alan Roberson, formerly of ASDWA, and he, for his own Fairfax Water, where he's on the board, helped with their SRF application. Took about 40 to 80 hours to complete. And so when you think about that stress of making the application process achievable and equitable, I think there are, I'd love for you to talk about some ways that you see some states maybe doing that well, or even just some opinions of how we could get better at making it easier to access, because time constraints are real.
So I think some states have legislative direction. So, for example, Virginia is legislatively required to prioritize funding to small communities. Other states have a lot of the process in their regulations, which is very difficult. I mean, people go, oh, just change the regulation. Well, it's very difficult to change a regulation. Pennsylvania, I know, has a lot of their process embedded in state regulation. And then on top of that, there are also a lot of federal requirements that cannot be avoided. So you have Davis-Bacon, you have American Iron and Steel, you have Build America, Buy America. On the clean water side, you have an architectural and engineering procurement process. You have a fiscal sustainability plan. You've got a cost benefit analysis for green technology. And so it's a lot. And so one thing that we advocated for when I was at CIFA was we had an initiative called More Protection, Less Process. And it was to say, are we getting the bang for the buck for all of these mandates? And is there a way to reduce the burden and cost of compliance on the borrowers? Because again, this is their money. I mean, they're borrowing the money. It's not a grant. And so is there a way to, reduce that burden and streamline? I think a lot of SRFs as well go through a process of, how can we change? Arkansas went through sort of a streamlining process a few years ago and realized and learned through that process that they were requiring a public meeting that was a legacy of the precursor to the SRFs, the construction grant program. And so they immediately said, we're not going to do this public meeting anymore because there's no requirement, there's no additional value from it. So I think it is a process of continual improvement and evaluation and learning and feedback. But some of the things are, unfortunately, it's a part of a loan process. So
yeah,
it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the money. So there's the drinking water and clean water SRF process. And, the last administration also passed some laws, and I'm referring to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, where about $15 billion were earmarked towards lead and lead service. And there's been a lot of chatter in our industry and a lot of statistics thrown around. I'll just quote one. Bluefield said that of that, I think only 3% of that total funding had even been granted to actual projects. So, Deirdre, where are we? Can you speak to that and help us understand what's going on there?
Absolutely. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act actually appropriated $43.4 billion in total funding to the SRFs, and 15, as you said, Megan, was allocated and directed just toward lead service line inventories and replacement. And so I'm going to break the country down into sort of two groups. There are the group of states that have known lead problems, the Midwest and New England primarily, but there are situations and cases where there are cities across the country that may have lead. And then you have states that don't have a known lead problem. So places like Florida, Georgia, and the Southeast, California, and Oregon, and Washington State, they don't have these lead problems. But the way that the funding was allocated in the first year was just based on it was not based on whether or not you had lead or not. It was based on the Bain allotment formula. So the money didn't actually go to where there was a problem. And this was known. This was a way to get the money out there. And there is a process embedded within the SRFs to reallocate those funds. But it was known that there were some states that were not going to have as much lead service line replacement. Everybody had to do a lead service line inventory, but it was known that there was not going to be as many replacement projects. So in the states where they did have a known problem, 9 of them had actually taken advantage of what I like to call the Booker bill because it's just easier. It was a bill passed in 2019 that was sponsored by Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey that allowed the SRFs to transfer money from the clean water SRF to the drinking water SRF specifically to replace lead service lines, and 100% of that money had to be used as grants. So about $500 million got on the street back in 2020, around that area before the infrastructure bill hit. And so you had states like, for example, Illinois, which has a known lead problem, and they have a big lead problem, and they've been working on it and have been a leader in the forefront of replacing lead service lines as a state. I mean, they did not apply for the money right away because they had a pipeline of projects that they're already working. So states needed some time to build those pipeline of projects, even in states where they had had a known lead problem. In states where the problem was unknown, they literally had to build a program from scratch. And so that takes time. And they started with inventories. Now, one of the challenges with the infrastructure bill is that 49% of it had to be used for grants or principal forgiveness, but 51%, and in a way a little bit less because there are these set-asides, which is too in the weeds, but they had to be used as loans. And a lot of communities didn't want to take a loan out to do an inventory, or at least the initial inventory. And so, trying to build those programs in those states, it does take some time. The good news is that they're developed now. And so I expect the money to move faster or to be declined or not used and then reallocated to states that really have the need. So I expect things to, things are moving much more quickly now, but I think those are the reasons there may have been some delays in those funding. Unlike the supplemental funding, which, it's just more money for all the projects, so they could just push that through. They just, expanded the pipeline. So I think that's the reason. We saw a little bit of that on the emerging contaminant side as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's always one of those things that gets lost in translation when you're looking at leading indicators and lagging indicators, that like, in order to allocate funds appropriately, well, we need an inventory. Well, how do you get everyone to give it? Well, you need to give them time. How much time do you give them? 12 months. Well, we're 4 years separated from when the initial announcement of and so it,
well, the other part is that some of the delays are due at the EPA level. So, for example, the second year of the IIJA funding, 2023, was delayed because they decided to use data from the needs survey about lead service lines to allocate that money. So they had a new allotment formula. And I'll just let everyone know, I'm not a native Floridian, but I am a Floridian. And an enormous amount, the most money was given to Florida. And I can assure you that Florida does not have a lead problem like some of the other states. And so there was a lot of questions about that. And why did Florida get so much money? And so a lot of conversations. And so now they're actually have not released an allotment for the lead funding for 2026, 25 or 26, because they're going to make adjustments based on the data in the inventory. So the money for 2025, which was, eligible October 1 of 2024, has not been released from EPA yet. So there are there are a lot of factors that go into the speed at which the federal funding can flow to communities.
It all sounds like the good news in there is that we're using more data now that we have it to maybe make some informed decisions.
Well, I don't want to raise expectations that the inventories have a whole lot more data. I mean, I think there's still a lot of unknowns. It's a massive effort to do a national inventory, community by community, of the lead service lines, of the material. It's really any material that's being provided as part of a service line, which is the line that connects the water main to the house. So in some places you can make estimated guesses, but in other cases, you really do have to do potholing and digging up the earth. So I do think we're moving in that direction, and the more data that we get is going to improve. But I don't want to raise expectations that the inventories are the panacea that are going to solve this problem, because I just don't think that the data is still there. Getting better every day, but not quite perfect.
So I think the last question I have on the IIJA is new administration, new agendas, new budget. What is the future? What's the future for IIJA?
Well, so the Trump administration proposed a budget that cut annual federal funding for the SRFs by 90%, which was devastating. It provided $155 million for the clean water SRF and $150 million for the drinking water SRF. And the reason behind that was because Congress was just diverting all the funding to congressional earmarks. So earmarks came back in 2022, basically the same time that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act appropriated funding. And so while there was supplemental funding from the infrastructure bill, the Congress diverted money from annual federal funding. So it really wasn't supplemental. And in fact, the infrastructure bill sort of masked this problem. So over the course of 3 years, Congress diverted $3.73 billion in funding from a state-run subsidized loan program, which is fiscally responsible, to a massive grant program for congressional earmarks at EPA. So it's just been a transformation of how the funding is used, and it really impacts the SRFs. And so 2026 is the last year for that supplemental funding, and the proposed budget, if Congress does what they've done in the past, they are going to maintain top line funding at $2.7 billion and then divert $1.6 billion to congressional earmarks, which on a state level will give small states like $4 million for their entire statewide portfolio of water projects. So, but I will say on the next steps, I am a little sour on the one-time, infrastructure week, infrastructure bill and this big blowout of money, because it actually, allowed Congress to divert, annual funding, which is more reliable and has a better set of rules and a different set of rules for how the money can be spent. And so for me, I would like to see infrastructure era, where there is a return to, let's look at the programs that are working to fund water infrastructure or any infrastructure and fund them to the fully authorized amounts. The SRF was reauthorized at $3.25 billion each. So that's $6.5 billion. And yet they're only getting funded at the same levels they were a decade ago. And that's after historic inflation. And then all the money is getting diverted to projects. Now, I personally think more money in water, wherever it's going, wherever it's coming from, is good.
Yeah, we'll take it.
But depleting it and using the SRFs to pay for earmarks is just not a good idea. It's just fundamentally, it's not what the law intended.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like we're trying to create the mission of saying, hey, we need utilities to be resilient and sustainable, but we're also not necessarily putting that same pressure on the funding mechanisms to be equally resilient.
That's interesting.
And sustainable.
Exactly. Resilient, sustainable, and reliable. I mean, they have to know, you don't just kind of go, oh, I think I'll build a water infrastructure project. I mean, it's the financing alone, as you well know from the application process, it takes a while, and so depending on the project, it could be 3 months to 3 years, depending on how complex it is, including if you're doing planning through an SRF process as well. And so I think having an understanding of where Congress is going to go with annual funding is critically important for the future of the SRFs. And if funding ends, which is something that some in Congress have said, the whole point of these programs were that they were supposed to be self-sustaining. I think that's a little short-sighted because, the SRFs have to give below market loans. And so, they're not making money. It will be difficult to stay ahead of inflation at that pace. And so the funding pool, without new infusions of cash every year or, every other year, the program will the capacity will gradually incrementally shrink. Now, I think the other side of that is that the SRFs can consider leveraging, and about 18 states consistently leverage, which means that they issue bonds based on a pledge of loan repayments to increase their funding capacity so that they can fund more projects. And in some states, it's made a phenomenal impact because they have been leveraging since the program started. So they're actually able to fund twice as many projects as a similar size state that gets the same amount of funding because they've been leveraging for over 3 decades. So that's what I think, and I hope the water sector continues to fight for funding, especially as we're facing this big funding cliff, to make sure there is affordable financing, because affordable financing is what impacts household water bills. if you're saving millions of dollars on interest payments from a subsidized loan, that shows up in that water bill. And I think that's what we need to stay focused on.
No, I love that. And so I think I'd love to take a kind of a future look at funding, because I think we know enough now about the new administration's priorities. It does not look like some of these large infrastructure projects are going away. I think lead service line and pipes are going to have to be replaced. It may be a little slower schedule, but we're talking about like real dollars being spent on these capital projects. So Deirdre, crystal ball, how can we depend on the SRFs, and do we anticipate kind of any other laws to come from this administration to help kind of bridge that gap?
So I think the good news is that because the SRFs are loan programs, there's a permanent source of recurring funding. So even if federal funding stops, there's still going to be $100 billion plus in revolving funds to fund projects. So the SRFs aren't going away. They're just not getting new, and they're not growing, I guess is what I would say, unless they leverage. And I think, advocating for, annual federal funding for not just the SRFs, but for WIFIA and all these other water grant programs, all of it helps, create a portfolio of financing and funding that can really help communities address these pressing needs. I mean, the water quality standards are more stringent today than they were when the SRFs were created. The cost to meet those water quality standards is more. The lead service line replacement, which is required by the lead and copper rule to be done in a decade, I mean, that is going to cost money. And either it's going to fall on the ratepayer, it's going to fall on the state, or it's going to be a partnership with the federal government, the state government, and utilities in order to replace those with the least burden on the homeowner. And so I think really continuing to advocate, I do think that the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, that surplus funding kind of masked the project. It was like, oh, you got plenty of funding. You can't use the lead funding to replace a lead water main. It could only use it for a lead service line. So you could have a busted lead water main and you'd have to use the base funding for that. So I think, when that funding cliff comes, and it's, it's very apparent, I think Congress will make a decision on going either they're going to restore the funding or they're going to, basically end the program and just use the SRF funding to pay for earmarks. I think it's that funding cliff is what will create, a flashpoint for decision making.
Do you think that funding cliff could also be an opportunity in terms of job creation? I always wonder that, we're talking, how more creating American jobs than, being in your community, digging up and replacing lead pipes. Deirdre, do you think Congress is making that correlation between that particular issue and kind of job creation?
I don't think that's not what I've heard, but I do think I think it is a legitimate point. I would say the bigger issue is that if you don't have water, you will not have economic investment. I was at a conference in Cape Town, South Africa, and they had 0 day where some years ago, where they just said, this is the day we're going to run out of water unless we change behavior and unless we, develop more recycling. And so I think that the real challenge is that the water scarcity is a huge issue. And so how are we going to fund the technology centers for artificial intelligence unless there is water? It is a fundamental element of the technology revolution. We had the Industrial Revolution. Water was necessary for that. We're having a technology revolution, started some years ago and continues to grow. We need water for that. We need water for potable uses, but also for powering the Great American Comeback. And so I think it is not just jobs created by the infrastructure investment, but jobs created by what water provides to communities to be able to create jobs in the technology center or every other sector.
Oh, absolutely. I could not agree more. And our home state of Indiana was on the news precisely for that issue, that if we want to recruit, the Eli Lilly, best manufacturing sites or these chip centers, we've got to make sure we have a water resource plan. And we know exactly at any moment, at any time, where our resources are and where we need to augment, right, to recruit all of these high paying economic development tools, right? And companies. So I could not agree more. And I feel like that's where the future needs to go.
Well, and Megan, look at what happened in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi has had an unreliable water system for a decade, and they have lost 25% of their population, along with the jobs that go with it, because of that water crisis that went on for way too long. And so water is the foundation of the economy in so many ways. And because it's hidden underground, oftentimes people just take it for granted that the water coming out of their tap is going to continue to flow at the quality that they've become accustomed to. And that's not the case. The federal, state, and local governments have a responsibility to invest in the infrastructure that is going to protect public health, which is critical. It's going to keep water bills affordable, which is also a public health issue, and that's going to fuel the economy. And so, to me, it's just it should be a higher priority for this administration, for the Congress, and I hope it does become one. I hope it is elevated to a major priority.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is so well said. Taking it from the mindset of it's only something we consume to it's something that drives an economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That is a great perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things I always appreciated with you as executive director of STIFA, Deirdre, is you were able to understand the situational, state by state needs, and how can we make this association, relevant to those unique circumstances, right? And it can't just be we've talked about this before, a national average divided by 50 states and Puerto Rico, right? So, I mean, and what do you think? Do you think there are any examples right now where we are applying kind of just national averages to a problem or to the scenario?
So I think that, yes, I do. And I think people look at the research and they don't understand it. And it's frustrating for researchers because they want to have a soundbite at the end of the day. They want to have a conclusion. And it's very difficult to draw a conclusion on 102 different programs that have different priorities, different challenges, different competition. You have some states that have a lot of free money. So why would you get a grant why would you get a loan if you can get a grant? I mean, it's just every state has a unique situation. But for me, I think that the one stat that I love to tell people is that the EPA will measure fund utilization. So every SRF has to commit all of their federal funding and all of their state match within 1 year of receipt. So that money gets committed. It's not awarded because an award is for a grant, but it's committed to a loan. And then the community, as they build their project, draw down those funds. But 82% of the SRFs commit all of their funding. And that means, 90% of their funding. So 82% of SRFs commit, 80% of their funding. Let me try that again. So you'll have to cut this out. You can edit this. 82% of the SRFs have fund utilization of 80% or more. That means that they are using all their federal money and and much of their loan repayments in a constant revolving cycle. And so I think that's really impressive for an SRF who has money. It's a bank. And so money is constantly moving into and out of the program. And states have very sophisticated cash flow models so that they can make commitments to more projects. And it's just constantly moving. And so I think a fund utilization of 80+%, which is a B, it's 2/3 have a fund utilization of 90% or more. I mean, that is really impressive and shows how the money is being recycled to fund more and more projects. So, I think you have to look at it on a state by state basis, and where states need help to move the money if they have challenges, that's where we should focus the energy instead of sort of creating a national statistic that may not reflect what's happening in the vast majority of states.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So where do you think we are? I always like to ask this question 5 years from now.
Well, I hope we're talking about a reauthorization of the SRFs at $15 billion and not just, $3.25 billion. I hope that the SRFs will continue to receive support from Congress and that they do find an alternative source of revenue to fund earmarks so that it's not coming at the expense of state projects. I mean, I think that there's, you're not going to balance the budget on the backs of the state revolving funds. And so I think we need to make the priority, public health, affordability, and investment in the economy. And the SRFs are the perfect vehicle to help support that. So my hope is in 5 years that we will look back upon this and say, I don't know what Congress was thinking when they were diverting the funds, and thank God we're back to normal and even better. I mean, that's my hope, but I think it's going to take a lot of work to get there because, as much as people may say that they don't support earmarks, somebody else's earmarks, are not my earmarks. So I think that's the key issue is saying, can we identify enough revenue to support both state and congressional priority projects.
Yeah, it's critical. Well, now Deirdre, your career obviously spans way beyond just the SRF. But I just think it was so important to bring light to this tool and this vehicle and how it does affect, at the end of the day, our public health, right? And our ability to have. I mean, I love the. I mean, I don't love the Jackson, Mississippi example, but I think that is a real life example of what happens when we're not making investments and what will happen to communities. And I think at the end of the day, it's a public health issue. And I think, distilling it down from where the money comes from to the tap is just going to be so interesting for our listeners.
Absolutely. And it is a public health issue. I mean, waterborne diseases are real. I mean, having clean water in the environment, having safe drinking water come out of your tap. I mean, these are issues that we take for granted, as I said before, and we really do need to remind people that it's a public health issue, and that the cost of health, remediating these situations, or the cost of the hit to productivity because of poor public health, there is a cost to that, and it's usually more than the investment. So you pay now, pay later, and I would prefer to pay upfront, invest in the infrastructure so that we don't have a crisis.
Yes, yeah. Well, we are right there with you, and it's going to be fast. It's going to be fascinating to see what the next few years brings, for sure. So. Well, thank you so much. Is there, Isaac, anything else?
No, I mean, all I can say is I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate your insight and just your perspective and just the way you've been serving states and kind of being a clear advocate for what we need.
Yeah.
I am a state person, though. You can accomplish a lot on the state level, and I think what my experience was, and the data proves all over the country, that states are the ones that can accomplish big changes. And so we should celebrate that opportunity instead of trying to standardize things across states. And I think Indiana is another great example. I mean, lots of reform and change in that state, a lot of leadership in that state to get things done. And I think, celebrating and valuing that, we called them laboratories of innovation. So you've got 50 laboratories of innovation. So let's use them to improve and then to share across the country.
I love that. Well, if folks on the listening today want to get a hold of you, Deirdre, where can they reach out to Finn Consulting?
So you can find me on the internet at www.finstrategies.com. And I also have a blog. You can sign up there. It's called Finsights. And I talk a lot about water and what's happening across the water sector, but a lot of information about the SRFs and what's happening. And Congress gets back in September, and they will be making decisions about appropriations, whether it's a continuing resolution, and I will be following that very closely and reporting on that in detail. So I would look forward to, providing all that information and those Finsights to your audience.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, we can't wait to connect with you again in the future.
Well, that was a lot of fun. And I think you and I could have gone on for probably another hour on that topic.
We could have. We easily nerd out on water and finance.
We do. And I don't know. I think that this program is so niche, and not a lot of people really understand it and are honestly are as passionate and understand just the complexities of the state by state nuances. And one of the things I think Deirdre said that I just think is so important is the continuous education around the importance of these programs, because administrations are going to shift, new folks are going to come in and run these funds, and it really is important that we are continuously educating these folks on these vehicles so that they continue to get funded and just help fund critical programs.
Yeah, totally. And I was just struck by that aspect. I think what really stood out to me was the mindset of how we can think about water as something we consume, and therefore it's a necessary service, but flipping it from an economic standpoint and saying it is an economic driver.
It is.
If we don't have these services, we don't have a community.
Yeah.
And it impacts population, the ability to attract businesses, jobs, and we have to think about it not just in the short term of what do we need to keep delivering these services, but what kind of communities do we want to build, and what is that going to require?
Yeah.
And so I can certainly see us bringing Deirdre back so we can all nerd out again.
Yep.
Because that's a fun conversation for us. So we can't thank you enough for tuning in and listening to this episode of Make Water Work. And again, like, share, follow. Most importantly, if you have someone that you really admire for making water work, please share that with us. We would love to have that conversation, and we can't wait to see you next week. Thanks for listening to the Make Water Work podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Connect with us on LinkedIn or send us a message. Together, we can make water work for everyone.